I stood frozen at the edge of the hallway, my suitcase still clutched in my hand, as Elise smiled like she hadn't just erased me. "We needed the space," she said, motioning to the empty bedroom that used to be mine. My bed? Gone. My photos? Packed away. My room? Given to her parents? And me? I got the garage sofa. After selling my condo to help them buy this house, after paying the bills, after calling this place home, they gave me 4 walls of concrete and a space heater. So I gave her 30 days. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Ruth's suitcase clunked against the kitchen floor as she set it down, the faint scent of lavender lingering from the weekend getaway. She had gone for 2 days, just a short break to clear her head. She should have known better. The house was unnervingly quiet. She paused, lifting her bag, and scanned the entryway. Her shoes were still lined up where she'd left them, next to the door. Her heart picked up a beat. When she rounded the corner into the living room, Elise was there. Her daughter-in-law stood by the door, smiling as if nothing had changed. As if nothing could. "Hope you don't mind," Elise said, her voice light, almost too rehearsed. "My parents needed the space." Ruth blinked, her brain running the words through her mind like a ticker tape, trying to catch the meaning, the weight. She was about to ask what space, when Elise stepped aside, revealing the hallway. Ruth's heart sank, the blood in her veins turning to ice. Her door was open, and her room was empty. The bed, the nightstand, the small green chair by the window, all gone. The walls, which she'd once filled with framed photographs of family, of her late husband, were bare now, like a wound exposed. Ruth felt a hollow ache in her chest. Elise followed her gaze, and a quick flicker of discomfort passed through her eyes. Then, with a practiced, casual shrug, she added, "We needed the space for my parents. You know how they are. Always need more room." Ruth's voice caught in her throat. She could feel the tightness in her chest, the way everything around her seemed to spin, but she couldn't bring herself to scream, to shout. That wasn't her. Not anymore. Instead, she nodded slowly. "I see." She didn't move, didn't even flinch. Elise shifted uncomfortably, like she was waiting for something. Maybe an apology, maybe a thank you. But Ruth just stared at the space where her bed had been, where her things had been. Finally, Elise sighed, clearly wanting this moment over with. "Come on, I've set up a spot for you, just until things settle." She led Ruth through the house, past the kitchen where Chris sat, his face in his phone. He barely looked up as they passed. Ruth's hand gripped her suitcase tighter, her nails digging into the leather. Then, the garage. It wasn't a space meant for living, at least, not living well. A cheap, mismatched sofa sat against the far wall, a space heater hummed softly nearby, and a folding table with an assortment of hastily packed boxes rested in the corner. The space smelled faintly of old motor oil and dust, a constant reminder of what it was meant for. Not sleeping, not living, not anything but storage. Ruth stood at the threshold, taking in the cold, sterile space. The walls were bare and impersonal, and a single dim bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows on the concrete floor. The only sign of any comfort was a threadbare throw blanket draped over the couch. But it wasn't hers. Nothing here was. "Here you go," Elise said, her voice strangely bright. "It's just for a bit, until my parents head back to Florida. You'll be fine." Ruth felt a surge of something hot and dangerous rising in her throat. Anger, humiliation, frustration. But her mouth went dry, and instead of speaking, she simply walked past Elise and set the suitcase down on the folding table. She felt the coldness of the room against her skin, as though the walls were closing in. Chris entered the garage a moment later, his face sheepish. He looked at her, his eyes soft, but didn't meet her gaze fully. It's just for a bit, he said quietly, his voice lacking the conviction to back up the words. His hand twitched at his side as if he wanted to do something, anything, but couldn't. We'll sort it out. You know how things get with Elise's parents? Ruth didn't answer. She couldn't. Her heart was too full of the bitterness of it all. She simply turned toward the door and walked out, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Elise called after her, but Ruth didn't stop. Outside, the driveway stretched before her, the sound of her own breath in her ears. She sank down onto the curb, hands clasped tightly together in her lap. There, beneath the weight of the moment, she realized what had happened. She wasn't just in the garage. She wasn't just displaced. She had been replaced. Her room, her space, everything she had quietly held onto for so long, stripped away without a second thought. Ruth closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, allowed herself to feel the weight of what had been done to her. The hurt, the betrayal, the suffocating feeling that she no longer mattered. And in the quiet of that driveway, she made a decision. One she would hold to, no matter the cost. She wouldn't be here long. Ruth sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background, her hands resting on a yellowing folder. The edges were worn from years of being handled, the pages inside marked with creases and ink smudges. She hadn't opened this folder in months, maybe longer. But today, she needed to. Today, she needed to remember what she'd done, what she'd given up. The scent of coffee drifted from the counter, where the pot was half empty, as though Chris had made it and then forgotten about it. Ruth wasn't in the mood for it anyway. She wasn't in the mood for much of anything today. She flipped the folder open with a soft rustle, the first page revealing a joint agreement for the purchase of the house that no longer felt like home. Her eyes skimmed over the numbers, over the details she had once trusted, once believed would keep her safe. $140,000. That was what she'd contributed from the sale of her condo. It was everything she had, all the money from the years she'd spent in a tiny one-bedroom place after Frank died. It wasn't much, but it was enough to help them buy the house where she thought she'd spend the rest of her life with her son and his wife. But that wasn't how it had worked out, was it? Ruth traced her finger over the section about the deed, where it was clear. Her name wasn't listed. Elise had insisted on keeping things simple. No need to complicate things, she'd said, flashing that perfectly manicured smile as she handed Ruth the paperwork to sign. Ruth had trusted her. She had wanted to believe that family mattered more than anything else. But now, sitting in the dim light of the kitchen, the weight of that trust felt like a leaden weight in her chest. The rest of the agreement, the one that should have protected her, should have ensured that she had a right to the space she helped create, was a piece of paper that meant nothing. It was just words. Words that Elise could twist, bend, erase if she wanted to. She slammed the folder closed. Ruth, you in here? Ruth didn't have to look up to know it was Tasha. She could always tell by the sound of her footsteps, that confident, purposeful stride that made Ruth feel like everything might be okay. Tasha appeared in the doorway, looking like she had just stepped out of a book club meeting, wearing a cardigan and the faintest hint of lipstick, as if she hadn't been planning on showing up at Ruth's house today. Her eyes immediately scanned the table, and she raised a brow when she saw the folder. "Is that the one?" she asked, crossing her arms over her chest. Ruth nodded, barely able to breathe. She felt a strange rush of gratitude for Tasha, as if her presence here could make everything make sense again. Tasha didn't sit down. Instead, she took the folder from Ruth's hands and opened it herself, her brow furrowing as she skimmed the papers. Ruth watched her, her stomach turning over and over with a mix of fear and anticipation. Tasha read in silence, her expression growing more severe as she went through it all. Finally, she closed the folder with a snap, her face a mask of frustration. "Ruth," she said, her voice low but certain, "this is a mess." "I know," Ruth whispered, barely able to speak. Her throat felt tight, dry. "I was stupid." Tasha waved a hand, dismissing the apology. "No, you weren't stupid. You were trusting. And you were too damn polite. And it's time we stopped being polite." Ruth's heart beat faster at the fire in Tasha's voice. "What do you mean?" Tasha's gaze was sharp now, more focused. "It's time to complicate things." Ruth blinked, not understanding, and Tasha leaned forward, her eyes piercing Ruth's. "You're not just a guest here, Ruth. You helped buy this house. You deserve more than a garage sofa and some half-hearted apology. It's time to make them answer for it." Ruth felt a strange surge of power course through her. For the first time since this whole mess had started, she felt like she might not be entirely helpless. "You mean, legally?" Tasha nodded, already pulling her phone from her pocket. "I think it's time to talk to Kenneth." Ruth's pulse raced. Kenneth Yoon, her estate lawyer. The one person who had always treated her like her voice mattered. The one person who could help her untangle this mess. Ruth felt something solid forming inside her chest, something that had been absent for too long. It wasn't just anger anymore. It wasn't just the ache of betrayal. It was a plan. A way forward. She grabbed her phone from the counter, her fingers trembling as she dialed Kenneth's number. It rang 3 times before he answered. "Ruth?" he said, his voice professional but warm, as if he was already aware something was wrong. "Kenneth," Ruth said, her voice steady now. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end. "What's going on?" "They took my room, Kenneth. I'm not going to sit back and let them do this anymore. It's time to talk leverage." There was a long silence, and then Kenneth spoke, his voice low but clear. "Let's talk leverage." Ruth's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The hum of the space heater was the only sound in the garage, a constant buzz that matched the beat of Ruth's thoughts. It was a strange, foreign sound to her now, one she could neither block out nor embrace. She lay on the sofa, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, staring at the ceiling. The low, industrial glow of the single bulb above her cast shadows that stretched long across the concrete floor. The smell of paint thinner and car tires clung to the air, a chemical mix she had never before associated with her sleep. Her eyes stung from the acrid scent, but she refused to close them. She had to stay awake. She had to think. Her body was stiff, uncomfortable on the couch that barely fit her frame. The cushions sagged beneath her, the fabric torn in places, the smell of dust and old engine grease seeping into the fabric like the memories of this place. This wasn't her bed. This wasn't her home. It never would be again. She turned her head slowly, trying to adjust, but the discomfort didn't change. She thought of her old bedroom, the one with the warm yellow walls, the soft light coming through the window, the memories she had filled it with. And then she thought of the garage again. It was a cold, unwelcoming space, a place no one should live. She had spent years making her home a sanctuary, only to have it stolen from her in a single afternoon. Her hand reached for the notebook on the folding table next to her. She had kept it close since she'd started this fight. The first page was filled with lists, things she had said to Elise, the passive-aggressive comments, the conversations that she knew now were part of a pattern. She had written down every petty dig, every word that had made her feel small, insignificant, like she didn't matter. She opened to a fresh page, feeling the weight of the pen in her hand. She needed this. She needed to remember. Not just for herself, but for what came next. Ruth had to get this out of her head. The dates, the words, the moments that seemed small at the time, but were now everything. She started writing. February 3rd, 8:15 a.m. Elise, are you sure you want to leave your place? It's so much work. You'll be much more comfortable with us. March 10th, 3:30 p.m. Elise, your room will just be temporary, don't worry, just until my parents get back. The words flowed onto the page, her pen moving quickly now, faster than her thoughts, as if she had to capture it all before the memory faded. She could still hear Elise's voice in her head, hear the way she had spoken in that fake sweetness that made Ruth want to turn her back on her own family. The coldness of it. The assumption that Ruth would just go along with it. Ruth stopped writing, her eyes moving to the small window in the garage, now covered by a dusty curtain. She let out a long breath. She had to hold on to this. She had to make it count. It was then that she heard the muffled voices outside the garage door. Elise's parents, Lorraine and Jim. They were speaking too loudly, trying to sound casual, but Ruth could hear the tension in their voices. I really don't know why Ruth is making such a big deal out of this, Lorraine was saying. I mean, it's only temporary. We've all agreed it's just a little change. Jim's voice was softer, less sure. Maybe we pushed her too hard. We didn't mean… Well, it's done now. Lorraine interrupted, her tone sharp. She'll be fine. Ruth's a strong woman. She can handle it. Ruth closed her eyes and gripped the pen harder, her hand trembling. She had nothing to prove to them. Nothing at all. The garage door creaked as it opened slightly, and she could see Lorraine's face, her too polite smile stretched thin as she stepped inside. Oh, Ruth, Lorraine said, the words wrapped in a false sweetness. We just wanted to thank you again for your hospitality. We've had such a lovely stay. Ruth smiled back, her lips pulling tight, but she didn't speak. What was there to say? What could she say? Elise's parents had taken over her space, her room, her life, and now they were thanking her for letting them do it? I'm sure you have a lot of other things to do, Lorraine continued, trying to fill the awkward silence, but Ruth didn't answer. She didn't need to. Lorraine's smile faltered before she turned, clearly uncomfortable, and walked out. The door clicked shut behind her. Ruth sat in the silence that followed, the garage swallowing the sound of their footsteps. She could feel her heart still racing, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was something else, something far colder, something that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. The doorbell rang in the house, and Ruth's phone buzzed on the table beside her. She picked it up and saw the notification. Kenneth Yoon. Draft ready. Temporary cohabitation motion. She opened the email, her fingers shaking as she read through the legal jargon. The words clearer now. Ruth could feel the fire ignite inside her. This was it. This was how it would be. No more rooms to give. No more hospitality to offer. This was her time. Ruth sat at the kitchen table again, the silence heavy around her. The papers before her felt different now, crisp, official, filled with the certainty that only the law could offer. She felt her pulse quicken as she smoothed the edges of the notarized letter, the ink still fresh. It was final. It wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was the weapon she was going to use to take back what was hers. Her phone buzzed on the table, the sound sharp in the quiet. She grabbed it, eyes scanning the screen for a moment before her gaze locked on Kenneth's name. Kenneth Yoon. Draft finalized. Cohabitation status review ready for filing. Please confirm before serving. Her heart skipped a beat. The motion was ready. The legal steps she'd been quietly preparing for had reached their final point. She wasn't in the garage anymore. She was in control. The door to the kitchen creaked open. Tasha appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, wearing that determined expression Ruth had come to rely on. She took in the scene, the table scattered with papers, Ruth sitting with that steady resolve, and nodded in approval. "You ready?" Tasha asked, her voice low, as though sensing the shift in Ruth. Ruth nodded, her eyes never leaving the papers. "We're doing this." Tasha stepped forward, pulling a camera from her bag. "Let's get those photos then. We'll need them for the court filing." Ruth pushed herself up from the chair, walking over to the door that led to the garage. The old, rusted handle turned easily in her hand, and as she stepped into the space, the scent of oil and dust hit her once again. The garage had been a place for storage, a place for tools, not a place for anyone to sleep. But now it was where her rights had been stripped away. Tasha started clicking photos immediately, capturing the mismatched furniture, the half-lit corner with the broken lamp, the folding table that doubled as a desk and a dining table. Ruth stood by, her arms folded across her chest, her face an unreadable mask. Click, click. "Get a good one of the heater, too," Ruth said quietly, her voice sharp but controlled. She could hear the crackle of the heater in the background as it kicked back on, adding to the sterile ambiance. The light flickered overhead, as if protesting its own existence in this space. "You don't need to remind me," Tasha muttered, snapping another shot. Ruth stood in the center of the room, her eyes sweeping over everything. The worn-out couch, the cluttered table, the broken lamp. This was where she had been forced to stay. Forced to surrender. She didn't belong here. She was done playing the role of a guest. No more. The photographs were done in under 10 minutes. Tasha packed the camera away, giving Ruth a satisfied nod. Ruth took one last look around the garage, then turned and walked back to the house, her steps steady, the weight of the decision solidifying with every movement. When she entered the kitchen again, Ruth grabbed the notarized letter and held it up. Her voice was calm, but it was tinged with something else, something colder than she had felt before. "It's done," she said. "It's ready to serve." Tasha gave her a sharp, encouraging look. "Good. Time to make it official." Ruth walked out into the hallway, the letter in hand, and knocked lightly on the door to the living room where Chris and Elise were. She could hear them talking inside, voices muffled through the walls. She didn't wait for permission to enter. She never would again. She pushed open the door. Elise was sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in hand, her smile tight. Chris was seated beside her, his phone still in his hand, but now his gaze turned toward Ruth. His expression faltered as he saw the letter in Ruth's hand. "Ruth?" Elise's voice was a little too sweet, a little too practiced. "What's all this?" Ruth stepped forward, holding the letter out toward her son and daughter-in-law. "It's a formal review of co-owner status." Elise's eyes widened as she snatched the letter from Ruth's hand. She skimmed it quickly, her face transforming from concern to disbelief. You went behind our backs?" Elise's voice rose, a slight tremor creeping in. Ruth's lips twitched into a small, tight smile. "No. I walked out of your garage." Elise's face turned bright red, and for the first time, Ruth saw her truly shaken. The mask of control slipped for a moment, revealing the real anger beneath. Chris shifted uncomfortably beside her, setting his phone down. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes flicking between Ruth and Elise. "Mom, please, can't we just talk about this? It doesn't have to go like this." Ruth didn't flinch, didn't give an inch. She met Chris's eyes, her gaze unwavering. "There's nothing to talk about." Elise let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, her eyes flashing with something close to fury. "So this is what you've been planning behind our backs? You can't just take back everything you gave us." Ruth leaned forward, her voice quiet but laced with steel. "I didn't give you anything. I offered you a room, a space in my life. You took it. And now I'm taking it back." Chris looked like he might say something else, but Ruth turned and walked out, not waiting for him to follow or speak. She didn't need to. Ruth had already made her decision. There was nothing left to say. The letter sat on the kitchen counter like a promise. Ruth had left it there, waiting. She was used to the stillness now, the quiet that hung in the air after the storm of confrontation. But today, something was different. She wasn't waiting for an apology or a change of heart. She wasn't waiting for anything except the next move. Elise had brushed her off. That much was clear the moment Ruth handed over the papers. "She's bluffing," Elise had muttered, barely looking at the letter, waving it off as if it was a mere inconvenience, like a fly to swat away. "It's just a legal thing. It's nothing." Ruth's jaw had tightened, but she didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her actions would speak louder than words. In the days that followed, Ruth kept track of everything. The small, subtle dismissals, the cold shoulder from Chris, the passive-aggressive remarks that always seemed to have just enough of a smile to disguise the insult. The little things that were impossible to ignore. The way Elise would turn away when Ruth came into a room. The way Chris wouldn't meet her eyes. The blocking of access to the shared spaces, as if Ruth had somehow become the intruder in her own home. Each interaction was logged in the notebook Ruth kept by her side. She had to be thorough, precise. She wrote it all down. Times, dates, every word spoken. Every door that was subtly closed in her face. Every barrier built between her and the rest of the house. Her hand paused over the page as she jotted down another note. The feeling that had been growing in her chest since the moment she walked into the garage was now undeniable. They thought she was a fool. They thought they could play her, push her aside. And now, she would show them how wrong they were. Kenneth's next email came through a few days later. It was short and to the point. Motion filed, informal tenancy violation, preparing for next steps. Ruth felt a sense of finality wash over her as she read the words. She wasn't just documenting the petty slights anymore. She was turning it into something real, something unmovable. But the real shock came when she received the copies of the utility bills. Her name was still on them. Not just as a passive name either. She was still paying for the electricity, the water. The power in that garage was hers. The heat was hers. The light, the internet. Everything was still under her name. They had used her to build their home, and now they were using her to run it. She had kept the bills to herself at first, but now she spread them out on the table. The proof. The evidence that they hadn't even bothered to change a single thing in her name, that they had gone ahead with this arrangement, knowing full well they were playing a game, playing with her kindness. Her fingers trembled as she dialed Chris's number, but her voice was calm when he picked up. "Ruth?" His voice was hesitant, unsure. "You left my name on the utilities," she said flatly, not bothering with pleasantries. "Why?" There was a long pause before he answered. "It's complicated. You know how we are with the bills. We were just waiting for things to settle." Waiting for things to settle? Ruth's voice had an edge to it now, something sharper than it had been before. "I'm not waiting anymore, Chris. I've waited long enough." "Mom, please. This isn't the time. We've been through this," he started, but Ruth wasn't having it. "No, Chris. You don't get to play mediator anymore. Not after everything." There was a brief silence, then his voice dropped, a tinge of desperation in it. "You don't have to do this. For the sake of the family." Ruth's breath was steady, but her voice held no compassion. "What family?" She hung up before he could say anything else, her finger pressing the button with more force than necessary. The sound of the dial tone was louder than it should have been in the empty kitchen. A few hours later, another notification came through. This one was different. Ruth opened the email with a calmness that betrayed the turmoil swirling beneath the surface. County Mediation Office. Case. Shucker 45322. Notice of dispute hearing scheduled. Elise and Christopher Delgado required to attend with Ruth Delgado. Ruth stared at the screen, her breath catching for just a moment. She had expected this. She had known it would come to this eventually, but seeing it in black and white made her pulse race. Elise and Chris would have to face her now. There would be no more hiding, no more pretending. Ruth leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. The weight of the decision was heavy, but there was a strange satisfaction in it as well. She had done this. She had pushed them to this point. The mediation would be their reckoning. And she would be ready. Ruth entered the mediation room with a quiet calm. The polished wooden table stretched out before her like an altar, and she walked toward it without hesitation. Kenneth was already seated at one end, his posture straight, his face unreadable. The room smelled faintly of old books and fresh coffee, but Ruth hardly noticed. She was focused on the task at hand. She took a seat across from Kenneth, placing her folder of documents in front of her with deliberate care. The papers were a testament to everything she'd endured, every right she had been denied, and every step she had taken to reclaim what was hers. She flipped open the folder, her fingers tracing over the receipts, photos, utility bills. These were her weapons now, and she would wield them with precision. The door to the room opened, and Ruth didn't have to look up to know who it was. The sound of heels clacking against the floor signaled Elise's arrival. Elise entered in a flurry, her posture tense, her face flushed with barely contained frustration. Her eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Ruth before flitting away. She looked as though she had barely slept, her makeup slightly smudged, her usually immaculate appearance now a little more ragged. Behind her, Chris stepped in silently, as always. He was the shadow to Elise's fury, his gaze fixed on the floor as he moved to the chair beside her. He didn't speak, didn't look at Ruth, didn't do anything to acknowledge her presence. Ruth remained still, her expression as composed as it had been when she entered the room. She wasn't going to let their discomfort affect her. Not today. Elise sat down with a huff, adjusting herself in her chair as if settling into a throne. She glanced at Ruth with a forced smile. "So, this is what it's come to, huh?" she said, her voice tight, trying and failing to mask the tension in it. "A mediation? Really?" Ruth didn't answer immediately. She just placed the first document, one of the utility bills, on the table in front of the mediator, a man who had been introduced to them as Mr. Thompson. He was quiet and serious, already examining the papers with an expression that suggested he was used to handling more than his fair share of family disputes. Elise shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but Ruth remained unmoved. Kenneth didn't respond either, his eyes on the documents. Ruth took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. "Let's get this started," she said, her voice steady, betraying no emotion. "I've brought receipts, photos, and documentation of every action taken, every time I was told it was just temporary. This," she pointed at the papers, "is proof that I have been displaced from my home. These bills are still in my name. I was told I was being given a temporary space to stay while my daughter-in-law's parents visited. But now we're months in, and nothing has changed." She met Elise's eyes for the first time, her gaze cool and unwavering. Elise shifted in her seat, her mouth opening as if to protest, but Ruth was already moving on. "The utilities are still under my name," Ruth continued. "I'm still paying for things I have no control over. This is not temporary. It's displacement." She turned her gaze to the mediator. "I am entitled to my own space, just as I was promised. I am no longer willing to live in a garage, and if my name is still on these bills, I am still a part of this house." Mr. Thompson nodded, silently absorbing the evidence Ruth had presented. He glanced at Elise, who was now visibly flustered, her lips pressed into a thin line. This is ridiculous," Elise said, her voice rising as she leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. It was always meant to be temporary, Ruth. We just... Kenneth interjected, his voice cutting through Elise's frustration like a knife. Displacement, not temporary use, he said flatly, his tone sharp but measured. There is a distinct legal difference. If Ruth was moved out of her rightful space with no prior agreement on what was temporary and what was permanent, she has every right to reclaim her living space. Your use of her name on these bills is a violation of her rights as a co-owner. Elise's face flushed, her eyes darting toward Chris for support. But Chris remained silent, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed on the table. The weight of the moment seemed to press down on him, leaving him speechless. I don't understand, Elise continued, her voice trembling slightly now, though she tried to regain her composure. This isn't fair. Ruth was happy to help us when we needed it. We gave her a place to stay, and now... No, Ruth cut in, her voice calm but firm. You took my place, Elise. You didn't give me anything, and you've treated me like an afterthought. Elise blinked, the words hitting her harder than Ruth had intended. But Ruth wasn't here to protect anyone's feelings anymore. She wasn't here to play the kind, forgiving mother-in-law. She was here to take back what was hers. Mr. Thompson shuffled through the papers, his expression serious. It's clear that Ruth is entitled to her space, he said, looking up at both parties. The evidence here supports her claim of informal tenancy violation. I will issue a ruling. Elise opened her mouth to argue again, but Ruth was already done. She had said everything that needed to be said. Mr. Thompson's gavel came down with a sharp crack. Ruth, you are entitled to written terms regarding your space within the next 30 days. If these terms are not provided, Elise and Chris must vacate your home within that time frame. Ruth's pulse quickened as the words sank in. It wasn't over. Not yet. But this was the first real victory. The room was silent for a moment. Elise's face was a mixture of disbelief and anger. Chris still didn't speak. Ruth sat back, her heart beating in time with the quiet tension that hung in the air. The sound of boxes shifting, the creak of tape being pulled from a roll. It felt almost soothing to Ruth. It was the sound of control being reclaimed. Tasha was there, as always, practical and steady, helping Ruth move through the motions. Together, they loaded the boxes from the garage suite, her new living space that had never really been hers, into the back of Ruth's car. It was an odd feeling, packing up what little she had left there, but it was necessary. She had no intention of leaving anything behind. Tasha handed Ruth another box, her hands never slowing. You know, she said, her voice light, I always thought I'd be helping you move into a bigger place, not out of a garage. Ruth chuckled dryly, her fingers brushing the edge of an old photo frame as she packed it into a box. Funny how life works, she muttered, shaking her head as she taped the top shut. They worked in silence for a moment, Ruth glancing occasionally at the stack of boxes that would soon be loaded into her new space. She didn't need much, just a few familiar items, some photographs, a handful of books, things that were hers, things that reminded her of who she was before all of this, before Elise and Chris had made her feel like a guest in her own home. The air in the garage felt different today, almost lighter. Ruth was letting go of more than just material possessions. She was letting go of the idea that she needed to keep appeasing them, that she needed to stay in their good graces to maintain the peace. The peace was over. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a notification from her bank app. She opened it, staring for a moment at the large auto payment for the shared bills, the ones she had been dutifully paying every month, without question. She'd been part of the system for so long. No more. She tapped the screen, canceling the payment immediately. She felt a small but satisfying sense of freedom wash over her. Done, she said quietly, setting the phone down. That's one less tie to them. Tasha looked up from the box she was packing. Good for you. This isn't just about the physical stuff, Ruth. It's about taking your power back. Ruth smiled, feeling something shift within her. A deeper understanding of what she was doing. She wasn't just reclaiming space in the house. She was reclaiming the life she'd been too afraid to take for herself all these years. As they finished packing the last of her things, the sound of a door opening from the house echoed through the garage. Elise appeared in the doorway, her face drawn tight with frustration. She crossed her arms as she looked around the garage, surveying the packed boxes and the empty space that had been Ruth's makeshift home for the past few months. You really are serious about this, aren't you? Elise's voice was sharp, laced with disbelief. She wasn't asking, she was accusing. Ruth didn't flinch. She didn't offer any excuse, any justification. I'm doing what I need to do. Elise looked around at the boxes, her expression growing darker. You didn't really mean it, did you? She took a step closer, her words slowing, almost pleading. The 30 days? You can't possibly expect us to just leave. It's not fair to us, Ruth. Ruth met her gaze without hesitation, her voice quiet but unwavering. It's what I was given. Elise's mouth twisted into something between a grimace and a sneer. You're going to tear apart the family over this? Over a room? Her tone was tinged with mockery, but Ruth could see the crack in her armor now. The woman who had once been so in control, so sure of herself, was unraveling right in front of Ruth. There was a long silence. Elise seemed to search Ruth's face for some hint of doubt, some sign that she might bend, that she might soften. But Ruth didn't flinch. She held her ground. Elise threw up her hands in exasperation. You've always been so easy to manipulate, Ruth. Why are you doing this now? The words were meant to hurt, but Ruth wasn't swayed. She had been manipulated, but not anymore. Not ever again. The moment stretched, the tension palpable. Finally, Elise turned and stormed out of the garage, muttering something under her breath that Ruth didn't bother to hear. She didn't need to. Chris was standing in the doorway, his face pale. He hadn't spoken a word since Ruth had started packing. He looked smaller somehow, like a man who had aged 10 years in the span of a week. I don't know what you want me to say, he said, his voice barely audible. Ruth didn't respond at first. She just watched him, noting the way he shifted from foot to foot, his eyes darting to the boxes, to the empty space. The man who had promised to keep the peace was the same one who had done nothing when Ruth was displaced. He had allowed it to happen, allowed Elise to call the shots without even questioning it. Finally, Ruth spoke, her voice calm but filled with an emotion that was both new and familiar. I don't want you to say anything, Chris. You didn't even try to stop it. You let her do this to me. Chris flinched, and for a moment, Ruth thought he might finally speak up, might finally admit that he was just as complicit as Elise. But instead, he just looked at her, his face aging in front of her eyes. I'm sorry, he said, so quietly it was almost lost. Then he turned and walked away, just like Elise, leaving Ruth alone to finish what she had started. The sound of the coffee machine was the only noise in the kitchen, a soft hum that felt almost meditative. Ruth stood at the counter, her back straight, her hands steady as she prepared her morning cup. There was a sense of calm here, in this small ritual, in the quiet solitude of the kitchen. The world outside could wait. For now, it was just her. The steam rising from her mug, and the satisfaction of knowing she had reclaimed what was hers. She poured the hot liquid into the mug and wrapped her fingers around it, the warmth spreading through her hands. A small, familiar comfort. She could feel her heart still racing a little from yesterday, but there was a deep sense of resolve now. The garage was empty, her things packed and out of sight. She had finally made it. From the living room, she could hear the faint murmur of Elise's voice, rising and falling in frustration, a sound she had come to dread. Ruth didn't need to listen closely to know what was happening. Elise was sulking, as she always did when things didn't go her way, when the world stopped revolving around her. Ruth ignored it, taking a sip of coffee. The bitterness, a sharp contrast to the sweetness she used to feel in her heart when she would quietly placate Elise's demands. No more. The door to the living room creaked open. Elise appeared, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed. She looked as though she hadn't slept, her hair slightly out of place, her face tight with anger. "Are you happy now?" Elise's voice cut through the silence, each word like a slap. "You've got everything you wanted. You've ruined everything." Ruth didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. Elise was still trying to hold on to the threads of control, still trying to twist the situation, but Ruth wasn't playing along anymore. "I'm just getting what was promised to me," Ruth said quietly, her voice steady as she turned to face Elise. "I didn't ruin anything. You did." Elise opened her mouth to respond, but just then the sound of footsteps in the hallway broke the tension. Ruth didn't need to look to know it was Chris. His presence in the background, silent and passive, had become a part of the landscape, just as it always had been. He stopped just outside the kitchen, his eyes flicking between the two women. Ruth could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers gripped the doorframe like he was trying to hold himself together. He was the same man who had let it all happen, the same man who hadn't stopped Elise's manipulations. And now, here he was, looking helpless. Elise's voice broke through again. "Chris, tell her. Tell her she's ruining everything." Ruth glanced up at Chris, her gaze steady but tired. She didn't need him to speak. She didn't need him to fight her battles. What had she been waiting for? A hero? He wasn't the hero. He never had been. But Chris spoke anyway, his voice low, almost hesitant. "She gave us everything, Elise. Everything. And you threw her in the garage." His words were quieter than she expected, almost a whisper, but there was something else in them, something that caught Ruth off guard. Elise froze. Ruth stood still, not moving, her breath catching for a split second. For a moment she wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly. Chris had finally spoken the truth. For a brief instant it was as if he had seen what Ruth had been fighting for all this time, had finally recognized the weight of her sacrifice, the silence she had endured for years. But then Elise spoke, her voice sharp, like a slap against the fragile truce Chris had just tried to extend. "You're on her side now?" she spat, her face turning bright red. "You're just going to let her walk all over us?" Ruth didn't need to say anything. She could feel the shift, the tension in the air, like a storm that had been brewing for too long. She could feel it in Chris's silence, in the way his eyes refused to meet hers now, in the way he was suddenly unsure of where he stood. She didn't look at him. She turned away, her back to both of them as she focused on the countertop. The moment had passed, and no words could change what had happened. The pieces had fallen into place, and there was no undoing it. Tasha's voice cut through the air, unexpected and clear. She had been standing in the hallway, watching the whole exchange, and Ruth hadn't even realized it. "You hear that, Ruth?" Tasha's words were light, almost teasing, but there was a hard edge beneath them. "Sounds like guilt." Ruth didn't respond, didn't turn to look at Tasha. She didn't need to. Tasha had already seen it too. The guilt. The cracks forming in the facade that had once been Elise and Chris's world. For the first time in a long while, Ruth wasn't the one carrying the weight of the family's expectations. It was theirs to bear now. Elise's voice was quieter now, filled with a bitterness that had no place to go. "You'll regret this," she muttered, her words trailing off as she walked back toward the living room. Ruth stood in the kitchen, her fingers gripping the mug tightly as she listened to the soft sound of Elise's retreating footsteps. The silence that followed was deafening, but this time, it didn't feel oppressive. It felt like a new beginning. Chris didn't follow. He didn't speak. He didn't come to try and fix things. For the first time in her life, Ruth didn't need him to. The morning after Elise had stormed off, Ruth woke early, as she always did. There was a stillness to the house now, a quiet that she hadn't felt in years. She moved through her morning routine with a sense of purpose, as if every action, every movement carried weight. The kitchen was bathed in soft light as she brewed another cup of coffee, the smell filling the empty space. But today, she wasn't just brewing coffee. She was brewing a new life. The thought settled inside her like something solid, something real. As she sipped, Ruth looked out the window at the quiet street beyond, the same quiet street that had seen so much tension in recent weeks. Today, though, she wouldn't let it weigh her down. She had made her decision. She was done. Her phone buzzed on the counter, the familiar sound pulling her back to the present. She grabbed it without looking. Just another notification, another reminder of the changes she was making. It was Kenneth. Kenneth Yoon. Final filing done. Ownership restructure is complete. You now have full rights to the property. Ruth stared at the message for a moment, feeling the gravity of it settle over her. It wasn't just paperwork anymore. It wasn't just about the house, the garage, or the bills. It was about reclaiming what had been hers all along. The respect, the space, the right to be heard. She quickly pulled out her laptop and opened the bank accounts she'd shared with Chris and Elise. With one decisive motion, she separated her finances from theirs, the utilities, the joint accounts, everything that had kept her tethered to their lives. Gone. It felt like an audible snap as the connections dissolved. The payments for the streaming services she had been funding? Canceled. Ruth took another sip of coffee, watching as the final strings to their world dissolved. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when she didn't need their approval anymore. But just as she set the phone down, she heard it. The loud slam of a drawer from the living room. Elise. Ruth didn't have to guess. The sound was unmistakable, the frustration that came with losing control. It was like a storm about to break. Ruth stood up, walking into the living room where Elise was rummaging through a drawer, her face contorted with anger. The noise echoed through the space as Elise yanked open another drawer, then slammed it again, hard enough that Ruth thought the wood might splinter. She's being vindictive, Elise hissed through clenched teeth, her eyes flicking to Ruth. The venom in her voice was unmistakable, as though she couldn't believe what Ruth was doing. She couldn't believe Ruth had finally stopped playing by her rules. Ruth met her gaze, calm but unyielding. "You don't get to control me anymore, Elise." Elise scoffed, turning her back on Ruth to march toward the hallway. But before she could retreat fully, Chris appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes tired. "Elise, stop," he said, his voice quieter than it had been in days, almost a whisper. "She's not being vindictive. She's being done." Ruth held his gaze, surprised by the firmness in his voice, the way he spoke as though he had just woken up to the truth, to the reality of everything Ruth had been fighting for. She didn't respond. What was there to say? She had already won. The silence hung in the room, broken only by the soft shuffle of feet. Ruth could feel the weight of the change in the air, the way it shifted like a wave crashing against the shore. Chris hadn't spoken like that in a long time. It was like he had finally let go of the weight he had been carrying, of the indecision, of the fear. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Ruth's phone buzzed again, pulling her from the tension between them. This time, it wasn't Kenneth. It was her old condo board. "The unit you previously occupied has just returned to the market. We wanted to let you know it's now available again. Would you be interested in moving back in? Ruth froze for a moment, her heart skipping a beat. The old condo. The one she had sold to help them buy this house. It had always felt like hers, even when it wasn't. And now, it was available again. The possibilities hit her all at once. The freedom, the peace, the chance to live on her own terms. She had let go of the past, and now it was offering her a way back to herself. Ruth smiled to herself, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Yes. Yes. She was interested. She typed her response without hesitation. I'd like to make an offer. As she hit send, Ruth felt something shift inside her, something deep and certain. She was done with the house, done with the games, done with being invisible. She was taking back everything, her space, her life, her future. She didn't need their approval anymore. She didn't need them. The door behind her creaked open, and Elise appeared. Her eyes narrowed. But Ruth didn't flinch. She didn't care anymore. Elise could be as angry as she wanted. Ruth had already moved on. The final pieces were falling into place. And Ruth wasn't looking back. Ruth stood at the threshold of her old condo, her fingers brushing the cool metal handle. The building was the same, a quiet structure nestled in a small, welcoming neighborhood. But everything else had changed. The last time she had walked through these doors, it had been a goodbye, a sacrifice she had made for them. A sacrifice that had cost her more than just a space to live. Now, as she stepped inside, the faint scent of fresh paint and new wood filled the air. The floors gleamed, and the walls, once an off-white color, were now a soft shade of gray that reflected the sunlight pouring through the large windows. Everything was sleek, polished, upgraded. Nothing like the worn-in, lived-in feel it had once had. But it didn't matter. This was home. Ruth walked deeper into the condo, her footsteps echoing softly in the emptiness. The kitchen was stunning. New appliances, marble countertops, everything perfectly arranged. It felt like someone had taken the essence of her old life here, scrubbed it clean, and turned it into something fresh, new, and untouchable. Tasha walked in behind her, carrying a coffee cup in one hand, her eyes scanning the space with quiet approval. It's fancy, Tasha remarked, her voice light but thoughtful. Ruth nodded but didn't speak at first. She walked over to the window that overlooked the street she had once known so well. There it was, the life she had walked away from, the space that was once hers. It was still hers, in a way. Now it felt like it always should have, untouched, unclaimed by anyone but her. She turned to Tasha, a small smile on her face. I'm not sure I needed all the upgrades, she said softly, but I'm glad they did it. It feels like a reset. Tasha raised her cup, offering a toast with a grin. Here's to resets. Ruth's fingers brushed the edge of the countertop as she continued her tour. It was a home, but it was more than that. It was her reclaiming a piece of herself, a piece she had almost given away. She walked through the living room where the furniture was arranged neatly, as if waiting for her to sit down, to relax, to own this space again. But she wasn't ready to sit just yet. There was still one thing left to do. Ruth walked to the small desk by the window, where the old papers she had signed all those years ago, the ones that had tied her to the house with Chris and Elise, still lay. She had signed them with an open heart, with the belief that she was helping her family, that she was making a home for them. But that was before. She opened the drawer, pulling out a checkbook and writing a number across the page. The amount was significant. It was everything she had saved from the sale of her condo, her trust fund, the one Elise had conveniently forgotten about when she had decided to push Ruth out of her own home. She signed it with a flourish and set it aside. Paid in full, Ruth whispered to herself, feeling the weight of the decision settle into her bones. It wasn't just for the condo. It was a symbol, A declaration that Ruth would no longer be the afterthought, no longer the invisible figure in their lives. She was closing this chapter for good, and this time, it was on her terms. Tasha came over to the desk, peering at the check. "You're really doing it, huh?" Ruth smiled, turning to look at her friend. "Yes, I'm taking back everything that's mine. Everything." They stood in silence for a moment, both of them absorbing the weight of the moment. Ruth didn't feel the same nervousness that had plagued her for so long. She didn't feel the fear of doing something drastic. Instead, she felt peace. A quiet, steady peace that told her she was on the right path. The phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. Ruth glanced down at it. It was a reminder. Move date, day 29. She stared at the screen for a moment, allowing the reality of it to sink in. In just under a month, everything would change. She would leave behind the house, the family, the life she had tried so hard to hold together. But she was leaving it on her terms. Turning to Tasha, she spoke with quiet resolve. "It's time to set my move date." Tasha's eyes brightened with a knowing smile. "You're really leaving, huh?" Ruth met her gaze, her heart steady. "Yes, and I'm not leaving a forwarding address." Tasha's smile widened. "I like the sound of that." Ruth walked toward the door, her fingers grazing the doorknob. Before stepping out into the hallway, she paused and looked back at the condo, at the space that had once been a symbol of everything she had given up. Now, it was a symbol of everything she had gained. Ruth stood at the threshold of her new condo, the door still cracked open, letting in the soft hum of the street beyond. It was early afternoon, and the sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the bare walls. The place was empty, except for the furniture she had insisted on buying herself: a cozy couch in the corner, a sleek dining table, and a few simple but comforting pieces. It wasn't much, but it didn't need to be. Tasha and her crew had finished moving Ruth's things an hour ago. The boxes were stacked neatly against the walls, ready to be unpacked, but Ruth wasn't in a rush. She was letting the space settle around her, letting herself settle into it. She had worked too hard for this moment to hurry through it. Tasha had left, promising to check in later. Ruth was grateful for her friend's steady presence, the way she had helped make this all feel possible. But now, Ruth was alone, and for the first time in a long while, the solitude didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a gift. She walked to the kitchen, her feet echoing on the hardwood floors. The cabinets were empty, save for the few essentials she had bought: coffee, tea, a bottle of wine. She opened a cabinet and pulled out a glass. It wasn't her old set of mismatched mugs and plates, but that was fine. These were hers now. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw the familiar name, Kenneth. She swiped to answer. "Ruth," Kenneth said, his voice calm and steady as always. "The ownership documents are finalized. The house is yours. You're legally in control." She smiled, the weight of the words sinking in. "The house is yours." "I've been waiting for this," Ruth replied, her voice soft but strong. "And I'm ready." Kenneth paused for a moment. "You've made it through the hard part. Everything is in order now. Just remember, if you ever need anything more, we're here." Ruth didn't need to say more. The finality in his voice was enough. Everything was falling into place, piece by piece. She hung up the phone and set it aside, her hands resting on the edge of the kitchen counter. Ruth turned toward the hallway, her gaze lingering on the small entryway, on the shadows that had become her own. She had no plans to rush into anything. This was her space, her new beginning. The quiet was welcome. No more arguments, no more passive-aggressive conversations. Just peace. The phone buzzed again, and this time it was a reminder. Ruth glanced at it. "Will update needed. Change beneficiaries." complete. She walked to the small desk she had set up in the corner of the living room. The papers she had put aside, the ones she hadn't wanted to deal with until now, were there, waiting. The will? Ruth sat down at the desk, the chair cool beneath her. Her fingers hovered over the paper as she thought about everything she had done. It wasn't just the house that she was leaving behind. It was the ties to a family that had never really seen her. She had given them everything, and they had taken it without a second thought. Now, she was taking back everything she could. Her pen scratched across the page as she made the change, her decision final. She crossed out the names she no longer wanted in her life, the names she had once trusted, and wrote in the words that were true now. The condo, everything in it, and the trust. To Charity. She signed the document, folding it with quiet finality. Her will was done. She was done. Ruth stood up from the desk, moving toward the bedroom with purposeful steps. There, on the bed, she set down a shopping bag. She had bought herself something, a luxury, something small, but it was hers. She opened the bag and pulled out the new sheets she'd chosen. They were soft, crisp, white. Nothing like the old, faded set she had left behind, the one that had seen years of wear. These were hers, chosen with care, chosen for the peace they would bring. She made the bed slowly, smoothing the corners, making it just the way she liked. There were no demands here, no expectations, no one to complain about the colors, the softness, the temperature. It was hers, just hers. The soft sound of the sheets settling on the bed was soothing. Ruth stood back, surveying the room, taking in the space she had created for herself. For the first time in years, it felt like she could finally breathe. No more compromises, no more giving in. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her fingers trailing over the new fabric, feeling the coolness of the cotton. The room was quiet now, the only sound the distant hum of traffic from outside. Ruth lay back, her eyes closing as she sank into the softness of the bed, the weight of the day lifting off her shoulders. There were no more interruptions, no more petty remarks, no more feeling invisible. She had her own space, her own life, her own peace. The first night in her new home, Ruth slept soundly, completely uninterrupted. The world outside could wait. Tonight, it was just her, in her new life, in her new home. Ruth had been living in her new condo for weeks now. The hum of the city outside her window had become a soothing background noise, a reminder that the world was still moving, still going on, while she had finally created a space where she could simply exist without the constant weight of expectations. One morning, as she sipped her coffee, she saw it. A letter, tucked under the door, addressed in Elise's handwriting. Ruth's heart didn't race when she saw the envelope. It was more like a dull, familiar ache, the kind that comes from remembering old wounds, not the kind that feels fresh and raw. She set the cup down, wiped her hands on her jeans, and stared at the letter for a long time. She didn't open it immediately. There was no rush. There was no need. Ruth already knew what it would say. It would be full of apologies, of justifications, of the same tone that had once made her swallow the hurt without question. Finally, Ruth picked it up and tore the envelope open with a single motion. She unfolded the letter, reading the first line. "We didn't mean for it to go that far." The words settled inside her, but they didn't reach her heart. She didn't feel the guilt, the sorrow, or the anger that they had probably expected. It was just a letter. Another attempt at manipulation, but this time, it didn't work. Ruth laid the letter down on the table in front of her. She didn't have to read the rest. It was all the same. She could feel Elise's voice in every word, her guilt-laden pleas, her twisted sense of responsibility that was always about controlling the narrative. Ruth knew it was time for something different. Instead of letting the letter stir up old emotions, she folded it up and picked up her phone. Without a word, she forwarded it to Kenneth, her estate lawyer, the one person who had always treated her like her voice mattered. She hit send. Ruth sat back in her chair, watching the way the morning light slanted through the blinds. The world outside was bright, full of possibility, while her past, those years spent cowering under Elise's shadow, felt so distant now. She wasn't that woman anymore. Her phone buzzed a moment later, a text from Tasha. Tasha, you gave them grace. They gave you garage fumes. Ruth chuckled softly, a sound that surprised her. It was a simple truth, one that had become clear in the weeks since she'd left. She had given them everything. The benefit of the doubt, her home, her love, her trust. In return, they had thrown her into a cold, uninviting space. But now? Now, Ruth had reclaimed everything, and it felt like she was finally breathing air she had been denied for too long. With a deep sigh, Ruth stood up, stretching as she walked to her living room. The stack of unpacked boxes in the corner still lingered, but they didn't feel like unfinished business. They were a reminder of the new life she was building, brick by brick, decision by decision. Ruth had always been an avid reader. The stacks of books in her old home had been her refuge, her escape from the daily grind. But when she had sold her condo, she had left most of those books behind. It was time to change that. She picked up her phone again and, after a brief search, joined a local book club. The invitation arrived quickly, and she smiled, tapping accept without hesitation. This was her new beginning, and it was hers to shape. As the days passed, Ruth settled into a routine. The early mornings with coffee, the quiet afternoons spent unpacking and organizing, and the nights spent reading in the soft glow of her new lamp. She was making the space her own, every single day. Soon, her story spread. People from her book club, and even people she didn't know, began to comment on her strength. She was called "was brave," a word that, until recently, had felt foreign to her. But now, Ruth wore it like a badge of honor. It didn't matter what Elise thought, or Chris, or anyone else. They had underestimated her. They had believed that by throwing her into the garage they could break her spirit. But Ruth was stronger than they had ever known. One afternoon, as she read a new novel in the quiet of her condo, she overheard a conversation from outside her window. The voices were familiar, Chris and Elise, arguing just outside. Ruth didn't strain to hear them. She didn't need to. Their words were muffled, but Ruth could tell that things were falling apart for them. Chris, with his conflicted guilt, and Elise, with her overwhelming need to control. Neither of them seemed to realize that the more they clung to their old ways, the more they pushed Ruth out. The more they stayed the same, the further she moved forward. Ruth closed the book, her fingers resting on the spine for a moment. The voices outside faded, but the weight of their conversation lingered. For a brief moment she felt the pull of what had been, but it was fleeting. It didn't have the power it once did. She had made the move they never saw coming, and now, nothing could stop her from living the life she had fought so hard to reclaim. The knock on Ruth's door was soft, almost tentative, as though the person on the other side wasn't sure if they were welcome. Ruth didn't need to wonder who it was. She had known it was coming, had known he would find his way here eventually. Chris. For a moment, Ruth stood still in the quiet of her living room, the soft hum of her condo, the only sound. The space around her felt solid, like a fortress she had built brick by brick. She wasn't going to let him shake that. Not now. Not after everything. She walked slowly to the door, her hand resting lightly on the handle, and opened it. Chris stood on the other side, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were red, and for a moment, it looked like he might not be able to speak. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had passed. Chris started, his voice rough, unsteady. "Can I come in?" Ruth didn't say anything at first. She didn't invite him in. She didn't need to. She simply stepped aside, a gesture that said everything. You can come in, but don't expect anything more. He entered, his footsteps hesitant on the hardwood floors. Ruth didn't move. She watched him, waiting, the calm in her demeanor a stark contrast to the storm she could see swirling inside him. Chris lingered in the center of the living room, looking around at the space with an almost bewildered expression, as though seeing it for the first time. Ruth waited for him to speak. Finally, he turned to face her, his voice shaking as he said, "You didn't deserve what happened. None of it." Ruth didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure she could find the words. Instead, she simply nodded, her gaze steady, her eyes never leaving his. He was waiting for something, for comfort, for forgiveness, for a reaction of some kind. But Ruth wasn't giving him anything. She wasn't going to offer him the mercy he had taken for granted for so long. He had stood by, silent, as Elise did whatever she wanted. As she pushed Ruth into the background, stripped her of her space, her voice. The room was thick with tension, and for a moment, Ruth allowed the silence to stretch, giving him the space to feel what she had been carrying for years. He had been the one who could have stopped it, the one who could have made it right, but he hadn't. And now, there was nothing left for him to take back. "I was too weak to stop it," Chris admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung between them, fragile and raw. Ruth didn't flinch. She didn't need to. She had known this was coming. The guilt, the acknowledgement, the desperate need to explain himself. But none of it mattered now. "You were," she said softly. Her voice was calm, almost distant. "And now I've made sure I don't need you to." Chris's eyes searched hers, the weight of his words sinking in. For a brief moment, Ruth saw something in his face. A flicker of understanding, of regret. He was broken, and for the first time, he knew it was his own doing. "I never meant to hurt you," he said, his voice cracking as though he were trying to find the words to undo what had been done. But there was no undoing it. There never would be. Ruth didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. His words, his regret, they were hollow now, and the silence in the room spoke louder than anything he could offer. She turned, walking to the window, watching the world outside. The bright sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows on the floor. Everything in her new life was calm, steady, and she wasn't going to let him disrupt it. She had made her choice, and she was done with the people who had never really seen her. After a few moments, Ruth heard Chris's footsteps behind her, slow and hesitant. He stopped at the door, but didn't leave immediately. There was one last thing he wanted to say, one last attempt to reach out. "I wish things were different," he said, his voice small now, almost lost. Ruth didn't turn to look at him. Instead, she took a breath, steady and deep, as if grounding herself in the finality of it all. "Me too," she said quietly. "But they're not." She didn't look at him as he left, the sound of the door clicking softly behind him, but she felt the weight of it all shift. There was no more room for guilt, for apologies, for what could have been. The silence in the condo felt different now, freer. It was her space, her life. As the door closed, her phone buzzed. Ruth looked down at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the message. It was from the local event coordinator. "We would like to invite you to speak at our upcoming panel on financial boundaries after 60. Your story has inspired many." Ruth's fingers lingered on the screen for a moment. Her heart thudded in her chest as she read the invitation again. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her story to reach others. She tapped accept without hesitation. For the first time in years, Ruth felt like she had found her voice. Loud, steady, and unyielding. Ruth stood backstage, her hands folded tightly in front of her. The buzz of the audience floated through the curtain, a low murmur that felt like a faraway hum. She had done this before, stood in front of a crowd, spoken her mind, and shared her thoughts. But this was different. This wasn't about a book club or a casual discussion. This was about her story. Her journey from silence to strength, from being overlooked to standing firmly on her own 2 feet. The panel coordinator had introduced her as one of the speakers for the event on financial boundaries after 60. It felt almost surreal. Ruth had never imagined herself as a public speaker. She had always been content in the background, in the quiet spaces, the ones no one noticed. But now, the thought of standing before all these people, people who had no idea what she had been through, filled her with a quiet but undeniable power. Her name was called, and the moment she stepped onto the stage, she felt the energy of the room shift. The spotlight hit her, casting long shadows behind her. She adjusted the microphone, her heart beating a little faster, but her hands were steady. "Good evening," Ruth began, her voice calm but strong. "I'm Ruth Delgado, and I'm here to talk about something most people don't want to talk about: financial boundaries after 60, and how the lines we draw are often the ones we let others cross." There was a ripple through the crowd. Ruth could see the subtle reactions, the glances exchanged between the attendees. She knew they hadn't expected this. An older woman, standing tall, speaking so plainly about something that most people tried to avoid. But she wasn't here to play it safe. She was here to speak the truth, even if it made them uncomfortable. "I spent years taking care of everyone else," she continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "My son, my daughter-in-law, people I loved, needed help, and I gave it. I gave them everything, including my home. I thought it was the right thing to do, but I was wrong. In giving them everything, I lost myself." There were gasps from the crowd, and Ruth could see their eyes widen, their attention peaked. This wasn't the sob story they had expected. This wasn't about regret or apology. This was about reclaiming the life she had almost forgotten she could have. She paused, letting her words settle in the room before she continued, her voice gaining strength. "When I was pushed into a corner, literally and figuratively, and told my space no longer mattered, I had to make a choice: to stay silent and disappear, or to take control. I chose control." She looked down at the floor for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The crowd was silent now, hanging on her every word. "I moved out of the house I helped buy," she said, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I moved into a garage, and I made it my home. But that wasn't the end of it. It wasn't just about physical space. It was about finding my voice again. And when I did, everything changed." The room was still now, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Ruth could feel the shift, the acknowledgement that had been absent for so long. "Sometimes it's not the big things that define us," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's the small moments of courage, the ones when you stand up, not for anyone else, but for yourself." There was a long beat of silence, and then, to Ruth's surprise, applause. Soft at first, then growing louder. She blinked, her heart swelling with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: pride. As the applause died down, a woman in the front row stood and approached the microphone. "Ruth, thank you for sharing that," she said, her voice warm. "You've shown us what quiet strength looks like. I think we all need to hear more of this." Ruth smiled and nodded, but her mind was still swirling. People were looking at her differently. They saw her. They heard her. And it felt like a small victory, one she hadn't expected. She wasn't invisible anymore. After the panel ended, Ruth was surrounded by a small crowd of people, mostly women, who thanked her, who shared their own stories of struggle and triumph. They were grateful for her honesty, her courage, and Ruth, for the first time in years, felt like she belonged. She felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. But then, as the crowd thinned out, a reporter approached her. Ruth had seen her scribbling notes during the panel, her eyes keen with interest. "Hi, Ruth," the reporter said, offering a hand. "I'm Emily. I'd love to interview you for an article about your story. It's not every day we hear from someone who's taken such drastic steps to reclaim their life." Ruth blinked, taken aback for a moment. "An interview?" she repeated. "Of course," Emily said, her smile warm. "I think your story could inspire a lot of people. You've given so many women a voice, people who've been quietly struggling for years." Ruth's thoughts raced. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her story to reach so many people. But maybe that was the point. Maybe this was exactly what she needed to do, to speak up and share her journey. Not just for herself, but for others who had been too afraid to speak. "I'd be happy to," Ruth said, finally feeling the weight of her decision settle in. Emily smiled and pulled out her recorder. "Great. I'll make sure we get the details right. I think we'll have a headline here, Ruth." Ruth smiled, her heart a little lighter than it had been. From garage sofa to full control, one woman's exit plan. The headline popped into her mind as the reporter began to ask her questions. It wasn't just a story. It was her story. And now, the world would hear it. Ruth sat in the quiet of her condo, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, casting long shadows across the room. It was peaceful now. Peaceful in a way she hadn't known in years. She wasn't used to being still. Life had always been a flurry of moving parts, of responsibilities, of never quite feeling like she could stop and breathe. But now, as she sat in the soft, deep armchair, her tea cooling beside her, she felt calm. Her fingers hovered over her phone, and for a long moment she simply stared at it. The numbers on the screen didn't mean anything to her anymore. She knew what she had to do. It had been building in her for days, weeks, months, since she had first stepped into this condo, her own space, her own life. The ties that once bound her to Chris and Elise were loose now, frayed threads of a life she had almost given up on. Her thumb hovered over the contact list. She had kept their numbers for far too long, kept them, hoping that maybe things would change, that maybe they would see her as more than the woman who had given everything. But she had stopped waiting for them to change. She had stopped needing them to be anything other than what they were. With one swift motion, Ruth deleted both of their contact numbers from her phone. Chris, Elise, gone. She didn't feel anger or even sadness. It wasn't about bitterness anymore. It was simply the end of something that had needed to end. She was free. As if on cue, the kettle whistled from the kitchen. Ruth smiled faintly but didn't move immediately. The silence felt like an old friend now, one she had learned to trust. She let herself sit with it for a moment, letting the weight of the decision settle around her. She had taken back her space, and now she was taking back her peace. Tasha walked into the room, as calm and steady as ever, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. She handed one to Ruth, sitting down next to her without saying a word. They didn't need to speak right away. Ruth could feel Tasha's presence beside her, the quiet support she had come to rely on in these past few months. They sat there, in the stillness, sipping their tea. Ruth could hear the faint hum of the city outside, the sound of life continuing, but it didn't feel loud. It didn't feel oppressive. It felt distant, like a world she didn't need to be part of anymore. "You're doing well," Tasha said softly, her voice a comfort in the silence. Ruth looked at her, a small smile curling at the corners of her lips. "I know. I'm starting to feel like I actually belong here." Tasha raised her mug in a silent toast, and Ruth met her gaze, feeling something shift inside her, something she hadn't let herself feel before. Hope. Not for anything to change, but for herself, for the life she had built, piece by piece. Ruth's eyes drifted to the corner of the room where her houseplants had begun to bloom. The greenery had been one of the first things she had added to the space, a reminder that even in the most barren of times, there was always room for growth. The flowers, with their soft petals, were a quiet testament to everything she had fought for. She felt a sense of quiet pride well up inside her as she gazed at the plants. They weren't the only thing that had bloomed in this space. The silence stretched, and Ruth let herself settle into it. She had given so much: her love, her home, her space, her energy. But now, she was taking back everything else. The pieces were falling into place, like the final strokes of a painting she had been working on for years. It was hers. This life. This piece. Her phone buzzed again. Ruth picked it up without hesitation. It was Kenneth. Kenneth Yoon. Final paperwork complete. The trust is fully secured and the condo is fully paid off. Ruth smiled to herself. The last pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. She was done. Completely done. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she read the message again. The condo is fully paid off. The weight of the words settled over her, but this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like freedom. "Everything's in place now," Ruth said, her voice quiet but sure. "It's all mine." Tasha nodded, the corner of her mouth lifting in a knowing smile. "You earned it, Ruth. Every single piece of it." Ruth took a deep breath, savoring the quiet satisfaction that filled her chest. She had worked for this, fought for this, and now it was hers. She had her space back, and with it, her peace. As the evening settled in, Ruth stood up and moved toward the window, looking out over the quiet street below. It was peaceful now, just like the rest of her life. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe without hesitation, without the weight of others' expectations pressing down on her. The sun was setting, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. Ruth watched it for a moment, letting the colors fill her vision. She wasn't looking back anymore. She didn't need to. The past was behind her, and the future was hers to shape. Ruth turned away from the window, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. She didn't need to leave a forwarding address. She had already taken everything that mattered. They gave me a garage sofa. I gave them 30 days, and took back everything else.